Is it great to be a professor of physics? Is it great to be a teacher? Absolutely. But that, I came to the conclusion, was not my path. What was my path? My path was to seek faith in, shaped, framed by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And I wanted to communicate that. So I made the choice. I quit a master's degree in order to focus on something that was of value to me. Now,
and then people said, well, why did you go into farming? But for me, farming is just a continuation of trying to work in a rural area. I started in a rural area. As I said, I grew up in a rural area, and I went to a rural area in Luero, and I'm so back to a rural area in Jojo, and through the work that I'm doing there, I can have a business that can be sustainable, can make profit, and can also impact the community, and can also help to alleviate poverty.
That one way to stay empathetic is to stay connected with the people who are on the margins. So I stay connected with younger people who have no jobs. I stay connected with the slums of Kampala. I meet with them, I speak with them, so that it's not their problem, it's my problem. It's us together. The real critical challenge, back to the conversation on empathy, how do we grow empathy? Because, David, for as long as the suffering is theirs, you have an us-them barrier, we will do nothing about it.
It's that those isms, because you're black and because I'm white, then you're different, then I'm able to do something to you, or vice versa. But you're a human being, and we are human beings. And so it's that attitude that has caused a tremendous amount of suffering, as you say, and rightly has to be resisted.
Good morning and welcome back to the Two Sages podcast. We want to thank all of you who have been following our conversations, and we hope that you have gotten questions that have improved your lives. And we are back with the Two Sages today to have yet another conversation that will get us questioning more about life and probably improve our lives. So welcome back. It's been a while from the last time we had a conversation. So today, instead of starting with what you've been experiencing recently, I want you to share with us one or two fond memories from your childhood, and then we shall get into the discussion.
Fond memories from the childhood. My goodness. Good morning. I don't know about fond memories. My father died when I was quite young. Can't remember what age I was, maybe 7 or 9. And I seem to have memories from my childhood in Ireland of being a farm boy, driving the tractor, cleaning out the chickens, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Interesting. I grew up rural, in rural Bufumbira, later renamed Kisoro. And a very simple family. We didn't have much cash. We had lots of food, but not much cash. So my brother and I and sister, we both dropped out of primary school because our parents couldn't afford school fees for primary school. And I can still remember how we spent that year with my brother. There was lots of bush, and there was still a lot of rodents, little animals. There were lots of bushes. So actually one of the things we spent our time doing was hunting. We used to go hunting in the bushes of Gisorora, Jakavade, Chiburara. I still can remember us pursuing a skunk. Anyway, lots of fun. I think fond in the sense of just nature, enjoying nature. It was part of life and living. I guess that's why I really struggle with concrete, too much concrete around me. So anyway, barefoot running, with not very much. So, yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's very eventful childhood. Thank you. I can imagine driving tractors and then chasing animals. Wow. So
So that sets us apart. Because driving tractors, I was barefoot, you know what I mean?
Maybe, I don't know. I mean, we're both in you would call it a village. We're both living in
In
rural
some
areas.
village, I know.
I happen to be living in County Antrim, and you were in Kisoro.
Yeah.
But it was probably very different.
Yeah.
okay. Right. So today's conversation is going to be on human suffering and pain. One of the unique things that we have as human beings is that we can suffer, both in our minds and also in real life. And it is also that we can inflict suffering. And one of the things that intrigued me about the concept of suffering is something that I read from Jordan Peterson when I was a teenager. He says that as human beings, we can contend with every bad thing that happens to us, from famine to being attacked, things from nature. But the suffering that is bestowed upon us by our fellow human beings is what breaks us. And there is also a book that one of my friends likes that I have not read because of certain reasons. But its title is about strong men. But the quote that I will say is the one that is famous. That's hard times create strong people. And strong people create peaceful times, and those peaceful times create weak people, and the cycle continues. Mm-hmm. So in today's conversation, I want us to start from your understanding of suffering, how you think its place in humanity and in people's lives. And then from there, we are going to go to particular parts of suffering. One is the part that I mentioned, that is inflicted by fellow human beings. And then the other one will be about empathy of suffering. And when we talk about that one, it's going to be based on a glitch that was observed by evolutionary people. They say it is that we are able to feel selfless and empathy for people that we know, but we can't feel it for those that we don't know. For example, some people say it is hard to feel empathy for people of different tribes or religions. So that is the foundation for today's conversation. It shouldn't be as dull as it seems. And he's nodding his head. Why it shouldn't be dull as it's seeming is because from the Chinese, there's a point when I loved reading Chinese literature, and they have that common yin yang theory, and where they embrace chaos, the dark side and suffering, and they say that is where creativity comes from. That is where the adventure, the things that make life worth it come from. So, are you ready to set us up with what is suffering? What is the place of suffering in humanity? What is it? What is it from your standpoint? Today we'll start with Zach.
Let me actually first reference the way you introduced this conversation and your earlier remarks. You may not even have noticed that you said how questions are crucial, and expressing gratitude to those who have followed our conversation and questions. And I think, just to highlight, even the whole question, the whole matter, issue of human suffering, it's how it raises for us questions. Questions about ourselves, questions about humanity, questions about the world, questions about questions. As I have grown up, actually, I have come to the conclusion that what matters most are not the answers we give, it's the questions we ask. And it seems to me that maturity has a lot to do with the nature of the questions we ask. And so I think that the subject you raise about human suffering is critical. I think secondly, your intro again, it could be gloomy, it could be dull, it could be somber, and that's fine. I think we need to learn to be at peace with those low, dark, because that's part of life. I think it's very easy. Modernity wants us to, hype and joy and pleasure and so on. But I think suffering is real, especially when we know that the majority of humanity live in conditions that inflict upon them. And I'm thinking more systemic and structural systems, systemic structural systems, processes that inflict upon. I think you've talked about nature. So for me, I think the issue of suffering and pain, I wouldn't even want to define it. It's been a preoccupation of my own reflection about our own lives, my family, my growing up. It's my own PhD research was on a turbulent country, Uganda, Uganda's history of turbulence. So I've thought a lot about violence, and there's definitely a link between violence and suffering. So I think I would talk about the suffering that is experienced at the individual level. And by individual, I can think about disease, suffering that inflicted upon us by disease. At the individual level, there is suffering that is inflicted upon at the micro. And the micro could be the individual, could be the family, could be a smaller community micro. And then there's the macro. And I think those two are different. And the way in which pain is felt from that suffering is also different. So I think it's very complex, really, just to say. Now, growing up, I grew up a happy boy. You asked about our own growing up. A happy boy, happy with nature and innocent. I first was introduced to a pain that I didn't understand when I was in high school, when we had to flee from the war. I was in Tare school that time, and we fled, and we were unsure where this would be. But the immediate way I felt it was when fellow schoolboys in Intare were being fed in, I still remember those Tata lorries, military lorries, and the explanation was that their parents, especially from the north and the eastern part of Uganda, their parents had been killed. This is 1972. So the tears that I had not known in ways that I saw them. Because generally speaking, as a family, we grew up rural, happy, had enough food. If I didn't go to school, I didn't think it was suffering. It was just life, Not too many were going to school. So it's really the encounter of suffering of en masse communities. I didn't take much thought about suffering of sicknesses or death. I actually didn't. And I could even say that it's never troubled me. Issues about disease and death, they don't trouble me as much as when it is an epidemic, and therefore it's the macro level that then impacts the micro, the individual, the family, the community. So for me, it's that level of suffering, that level of pain that troubles my soul, and for which I still seek. I have questions and answers. So it's sickness, the individual, the micro, the as I said, we didn't have much. We didn't have much cash, but it didn't really matter in the sense of I couldn't call that suffering. So this whole poverty, suffering, it wasn't something that I thought hard about. It's at it's a macro level. It's macro level. It's when, as I said, at Ontario School, these boys are being ferried in lorries and they're all in tears and it's painful. And then later, of course, so that's 1972 during the Idi Amin regime. And then I could go on and on. That, I think I would say. Then when I started reading to see the suffering inflicted by people who wield power or societies, particular groups, that I think is really what I struggle with. So just some thought there for me.
The interesting, Zach's talking there about communities, nations that suffer. And I think you see more disruption, civil wars, various things that go on in Africa than has been the case. There's been a relative stability in Europe and America. Then that was disrupted recently by the war in Ukraine. And so you find people, something was inflicted upon them that they never asked for. They suddenly found themselves being bombed or tanks or whatever. So when I look back to my boyhood, because I grew in Northern Ireland, there was that what they called the Troubles. So it was this flare up again of the Irish Republican Army, the Provisional IRA as it was, and people were being blown up, and they were being shot, and they were being kneecapped, and there was all sorts of terrible things went on. In the scale of things, it was very small compared to some of the stuff that's happened in Africa. I think there was about 3,000 people died in the Troubles over a period of several decades. So yeah, when you're talking about stuff that's inflicted on people, I think that if I compare, even in Northern Ireland, which was the most unstable part of the British Isles then, I still felt it was relatively stable compared to so much that, say, has gone in Uganda's history. Because when you look at Uganda's history from, well, first of all, there was colonialism, but then independence, and then it wasn't too long after independence that you had Amin, and then you had, so many people were killed during that regime, and when Amin got out, it's almost, there's been many years of instability, and I think one of the things that marks Uganda since the NRM came to power is Ugandans, they really don't want more of that. They don't want to go back to that same thing because, they've experienced, you're talking about the entire boys, the schoolboys who lost their parents. My impression is, it's kind of like, as long as we have some kind of peace and stability. So I would say Africa as a continent has experienced more than its fair share of sort of instability and then suffering that's thrust upon people. Now that we're seeing stuff in Ukraine and Europe, one wonders about the future. And of course, this is all about people in leadership, people in power, and what can happen then to the ordinary people as they, President Putin, obviously he hankered after a greater Russia, felt that Ukraine should be included, and then because this is one man, there's a lot of suffering that went on. But thinking about the subject of suffering at an individual level, it's not something I think much about, because I think that we are programmed to. I was thinking about what's the opposite of suffering. I've suffered personally from disease. From having cancer, having that cancer a couple of times, and it was very unpleasant. Having the chemotherapy and being sick and all that. It was extremely unpleasant, and I suppose there was suffering that I had to go through because of the side effects of the medication, and I don't think I would have gone through it if I had no choice. If I was going to live, I had to go through that. If I said I don't want this, then it was a choice of death or suffering. But I wonder also, as human beings, what helps us, what prepares us, for suffering, and I think of discipline. So one of my kind of mottos is small acts of discipline, small acts of kindness. We can do small things that can help others, and we can do small things that help us in terms of our own discipline. And in some ways, discipline is a sort of, you're choosing to suffer. You're choosing to, whether it's exercise or studying or, it's not something that you're getting a lot of pleasure of. And I'm thinking about, pleasure is the thing that you, it gets your hormones in the right state, and you enjoy that, whether it's a sensual pleasure or whatever. And then if you're a seeker after pleasure, it becomes hedonism. Then I think would be the right term for sort of the pleasure seekers. And I wonder, so some people their lives are more about setting it up such that they'll avoid the suffering and they'll get the pleasure. And if suffering comes along, then that they didn't ask for, then they're not very prepared for it. Whereas I think the people who have chosen to inflict upon themselves some discipline are more able to deal with suffering when it comes along, because that discipline, that self-suffering, is going to form character within them. And no one likes to suffer, but it seems to be a part of life. And we suffer from loss. We suffer from grieving, whether we lose our parents or we lose people whom we love. We suffer from, I'm talking at an individual level now, but it's all, even if that suffering is inflicted on us from a war or something, it'll still become individual suffering. And another thing I've been thinking about, and you sort of said, oh, well, what are your memories from childhood? And I don't have any particularly bad memories. But one of the things I've been thinking about, when you're at the beginning of life, it's like a few years makes a difference. I was 4 years older than my brother, so when I was 15, he was only 11. There's a big gap. Now, when you get the other end of life, where we're at, a few years also makes a difference. When you're in your 70s or 80s, you look at, you might have a decade, you might have 5 years, and so life becomes more, let me say, meaningful. You can't take it for granted. Not that we should at any point. I know you don't, David. You're a young man, but you don't take your life for granted. But certainly, at this point in our lives, for Zach and me, I think there's this sense of, well, it better be worthwhile. I mean, we're doing this podcast because we ourselves have had these interesting conversations over the years, and we thought, well, maybe that would be something that would be good to share with other people, because we come from these two perspectives, and we agree on a lot, but we're sort of complementary in the way that we look at things. So I think, when you get into you get older, like Zach and myself, you want your life to be meaningful, and maybe you'll have to go through some discipline for that, or perhaps maybe even some suffering. But not very many people embrace suffering in the way I want to suffer. No, with the exception, and this is only from reading about her, but it was Mother Teresa. And I think she had a belief, the suffering of Jesus, and then she had a belief that suffering, people who went through suffering were somehow cleansed. And so her, the people, the dead and the dying that she looked after, she was in that whole field of suffering. And I think she kind of had this belief that, they were cleansed. Is that the right word I would use? Through this experience of suffering they were going through. And some people have those beliefs. I don't, actually. I don't want to suffer any more than I have to. But if it comes along, I'd like also to be prepared for it. And I think that comes from what we choose to do in terms of the discipline in our lives, who we choose to be, and how we develop our character. Yeah.
I really appreciate especially the point you make here about discipline. And it seems to me you are highlighting something about our response or attitude to suffering and pain. Yeah. We can even use the two words together, suffering, pain. So, and I think we need to distinguish the kind of suffering or pain that is essential for good life. That is essential. And therefore, the invitation is to embrace it. Growth. There are growth pangs, pains. The delivery of a child is painful. But that's the only way, babies come into the world, even when you do a cesarean section. So there is suffering, there is pain that we must embrace. And I would say that's a conversation that really needs to be had, because there is a culture, a popular culture, that is pain, suffering, avoidance. And that's not helpful, because then it diminishes value of life. So there is a suffering one way, and I really appreciate the point you make about discipline. Discipline is to suffer something that would otherwise be bringing you pleasure at that moment, but for the sake of values demand that you suffer. So that's the one aspect of it. There is also suffering that is of solidarity. When you choose to be together with others, you make a choice to suffer with them. So there is actually suffering that we must choose, because it connects with our own very values. I can speak for myself, as one who sees people in suffering. Yes, I totally believe in the solidarity of suffering. And I totally believe, and that's why I think your point about empathy, I think to be human, to be together, and suffering, I think there is a suffering, the point I'm making, there is suffering and pain that we need to embrace. And I think there is suffering and pain that we must fight against. We must resist. We must say no to. Because especially that which is inflicted upon humans, upon other humans, that demeans their humanity, that devalues their humanity, their dignity, that it's kind of suffering that is repression, oppression, And if you don't mind, I actually wouldn't want us to reflect, and we can, if you think we need to, suffering that comes as a result of disasters of nature, when nature goes wild, you know, whether it's tsunami, whether it's, I find actually that kind, as the person you quoted referred to, those, yes, they hit us, they are evil, they are, but actually we seem to cope better with them than we are when it's repression, it's oppression, it's abuse of power, it's abuse of dignity. And so I think that if we can, and that I think we should fight against. And in fighting against that kind of suffering, it requires actually a certain level of suffering itself. It requires that you embrace that in fighting this repression, this abuse that creates unbelievable pain and suffering upon people, it's a choice that might therefore engender.
I think I'm reading a book at the moment about a family, and it's the family history over from the 19th century and through the first two world wars, and they're in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it's actually just the rise of anti-Semitism, and which eventually resulted in the genocide. And you mention about sort of sufferings we should resist. It seems to be that as human beings, when we inflict suffering on others, when we dehumanize them, when we, whether it's anti-Semitism in the Jewish thing, or the exact reverse at the present stage, where the Israelis are inflicting tremendous suffering on the Gazans, presumably also saying, no, but these are Hamas. So you put a label on someone, and then it allows one section of humanity, to inflict suffering on that other section because it's a different tribe. I mean, this has happened a lot in Somalia, and whether it's tribalism, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's you
racism,
put a label on someone, and then you somehow that justifies that they can suffer, and that's terrible, because it's that those isms, because you're black and because I'm white, then you're different, then I'm able to do something to you, or vice versa. But you're a human being, and we are human beings. And so it's that attitude that has caused a tremendous amount of suffering, as you say, and rightly has to be resisted.
I should say I'm enjoying this conversation, which I shouldn't be enjoying. But I think there's a lot of learning here for the people that will be listening to this. I want us to go further on the self-imposed suffering. Zach touched it and you also touched it. There are cultures where it is part of their, I think they call them rites.
A rite of passage.
Rites of passage
yeah.
to take you through some form of suffering. And also in religion we see like fasting. I've had a friend of mine, a friend of my uncle was probably in his 40s. He resigned his job and he said, I'm going to walk for 100 days. And he walked. That's like some self-imposed suffering.
Yes, yeah.
And there are people who do this in form of trying to find themselves, trying to find certain answers. I want to hear about that, what you think about that, whether you've experienced it.
Let me comment on that one. I think that, I've mentioned before, I see life in seasons. So life isn't all about a continuum. I have, from time to time, kind of wrenched myself out of my comfort zone to move into something else. And that is, I'll not call it suffering, but it's a self-imposed thing where you decide, I'm comfortable here, but in order to move on, I'm going to have to go here, and that's going to have a certain amount of deprivation involved with it. giving you examples, my first sojourn in Uganda was being involved in the founding of Chiwogo Hospital in Luweero. We were involved in that project for about 5 years with Church Mission Society. And it came to a point where we basically had to finish that project. And it would have been easy. The natural thing was for me to go back to being a family doctor as it was then. It was in the United Kingdom. And I had to earn a living. I had to put my kids through school and all that. And I just simply refused to do that, to take what was the most natural step. Ended up coming back to Kampala, again, with no sponsorship from CMS, then just coming in here. And I remember, because I met the chap after so many years, I stayed in a room in someone's house in Kansanga here. I didn't have a car. I'd had all those things, so I had, I'd gone through this phase when I was, fairly well-off family doctor in Ireland, left that behind, went to Luweero, started off, a very sort of different lifestyle there. But then it was successful in the sense that I had a hospital. I could have continued running that. It was, I was at a certain level of seniority and, other people working for me and so on. And then went back down again to having nothing and starting off again, working for somebody else or just starting this thing again. I think that degree of, I'd call it self-discipline more rather than suffering, but it's, we all think that we're owed something in this world. You're a doctor, David. Once you've qualified as a doctor, you think, well, now I'm a doctor, I'm not a medical student any longer. I've got this level of responsibility. And then you do your internship and then you keep moving up to something else. If you choose to go down again, start off again, it involves quite a lot of humility and suffering in that sense. Because I never enjoyed going back. Now I have no prestige. When I came to Kampala, it was like I was nobody, whereas I was somebody there. And I think that's one of the things. It's a form of a choice in terms of what you do. You've been through exactly the same things. Because you were a bishop in the church. You had all this stuff, and then you chose to.
Before, I just want to highlight something that I get from Ian. It's that there's these not pleasant experiences that could fit the category of suffering, but from your perspective, you're looking at it as this is what I have to do. This is. It is the opposite of what Zach says, that maybe it is in our generation of staying away from suffering. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think, David, if you don't mind, I think in part the way you asked the question begs, questions are shaped by, of course, perspective, framework, and so on. When you called it self-imposed suffering, I had a problem with that.
Okay.
But in a sense, it focuses on the fact that we must make choices. And the choices we make come with cost. And cost means you are paying something for something of value. So the issue, therefore, is value.
That's good. I like that.
Value. And if something is valuable, you're going to pay. And you must happily pay. When I made a choice, which I did, to quit a profession that was growing. I was a graduate student at Makerere. I was pursuing a master's in physics. My vision, imagination of life was to be a professor of physics, but it then became clear to me that that's not the kind of life I wanted to live, to be honest. Is it great to be a professor of physics? Is it great to be a teacher? Absolutely. But that, I came to the conclusion, was not my path. What was my path? My path was to seek faith in, shaped, framed by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And I wanted to communicate that. So I made the choice. I quit a master's degree in order to focus on something that was of value to me. Now, there are people who say, that's reckless, that's foolish. Absolutely. But that's your view. That's something of value. And I think, therefore, the real issue is not about suffering. It's about value. And Ian speaks about it. He finishes, he sees a medical career in Ireland. It's not what he wants, for various reasons, Same thing with me. I mean, there will be people who say, so I become a bishop, and thank you for referencing that, in the city of Kampala. And by the way, I did that after quitting a job in CMS, very highly paying. And people say to me, oh, you have sacrificed a lot. For me, I don't actually use the language sacrifice. No. Something is of value to me, I go for it. And I give up other things that I don't consider of value. I give them up. That's the story. And in giving up something, of course, giving up something inflicts a level of suffering or of pain. But that's the kind of thing I was saying. We must totally embrace and happily, because you are doing that which you believe. So when I retire, I take another retirement as a bishop, and I'm very clear I'm going to pursue, the pursuit, the fight for justice in this country. I knew that it would be costly. I knew I could be taken to jail. But I don't go to jail complaining. No, it's the cost you pay for doing this kind of work, And I'm drawn to people. I still can remember Luquia, Dr. Luquia, who gives his life in the whole Ebola, that first horrible Ebola. And Luquia is giving his life to save people's lives. Once you do that, there's going to be a cost. And that's fine. That's why we must celebrate the Luquias. We must celebrate the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, who, because they see something of value, they are ready to pay. That kind of suffering, it's important we embrace. It's the suffering, the pain, the price we pay in order to bring hope and freedom to others. The price we pay in order to achieve the things that matter to us. The price we pay for that, I think, is essential, and we need to embrace it, and embrace it with joy. In fact, there is a text in the scriptures that I found it has been significant for me, and it puts it this way: count it. And we'd had this conversation in my family with a friend. Count it all joy when you go through different kinds of suffering and trials, because the testing of your faith produces steadfastness and endurance, and there is no easy path to growth, So I think we need to be learning, these sufferings that must be embraced. And I like your word, Ian, discipline. Discipline, discipline is costly, but it's something that we must embrace. However, there is suffering, and maybe we'll get to that we must not only renounce, we must fight, because it's senseless. It is senseless.
I think sometimes your meaningfulness in life is when people say, I want to make a difference to this world, for example, sometimes if they are able to do something that prevents human suffering, that is very meaningful. And honestly, peace and security is essential for really any development of humankind. If you look at what's going on in Sudan at the minute and what went on in South Sudan for many years before that, they're not able to do anything. People can just exist. They can't develop themselves, because of the war, because of that, and that's why I say Africa in recent years has really suffered. I'm using the word suffered. from these conflicts that have left people not able to develop themselves, not able to pursue, they just have to exist. And I find that now, if one can do anything that can bring such conflicts to an end, that can improve and have peace and security in a region, that's fantastic.
So the only way to end mass repression, oppression, indignity, abuse of power, unfortunately, is through suffering. So there will be some who choose to suffer in order to end that kind of suffering. And I think one of the problems we face today is the unwillingness to pay the price. The unwillingness. I met a colleague, dear friend of mine, who said to me they paid the price to go to Luero, bush war. All right? And they were aware that in order to bring about sanity governance to a country that had completely degenerated to misrule and abuse of the gun, they would have to fight it. They would go to war. And they were aware they could die. But there is a good way of dying, There is death that's worth it.
Cause, yeah.
There's death, the cause, in order to create a better world. Yeah. So then I asked him, so when you saw things degenerating into the very thing you fought against, when you saw Uganda degenerating to becoming the very thing you fought against, why didn't you continue the fight? And you know what he said to me? We were tired. I was not ready to suffer again. And in some way, that's the tragedy that we face. And Ian, I think when you reference the predicament or the African crisis, and one of the things about it is that those who wield political power historically post-independence, I mean, the colonialists inflicted unbelievable plunder and so on, and they created a world in which we did not exist. But those who then wielded power on this continent were not willing to pay the price for bringing about the kind of freedom and liberation that this continent would be enjoying and experiencing. And as a result, so the real danger against us, I will say to you, is not suffering, it's selfishness, it's greed. It's the unwillingness to pay a price to make things better for others. Even medical advancements that we may go about. So I really think that you're hitting at a key point here, that there are choices we make because those choices are based on certain things that we value. And if we make those choices, there is absolutely going to be suffering. But that's fine. Absolutely fine. There's nothing.
That's the way through.
That's what it should be. We should be very willing. But there is a suffering that is self-inflicted, that is a result of foolishness. You see the difference? That is what I would call self-inflicted. It's foolishness. I mean, a student, you are at university, you don't study, you are carousing, or you have a job and you are not working hard, you are not waking up, and you will be fired. That is self-inflicted suffering. You could have done better.
I would say that's suffering the consequences.
Thank you. It's consequence.
Suffering the consequences. But actually,
so for me, I would say that's more the kind I would call self-inflicted. Yeah. Everything has consequences. So, there are consequences, like, as I say to you, I go on the street to fight corruption and injustice and so on. There are people who thrive on injustice. They will hit you. They take you to prison. Those are consequences. But those, I think we should all be willing to suffer certain consequences, but not others.
So I want to, my farm manager, Sylvester, he's a Kenyan. And he's been working in Uganda now for about 5 years. And somebody asked him, well, so, what's the difference between Uganda and Kenya? He said, Ugandans don't like working. I mean, this is, his experience, and he's managing up to like 1,000 people there. And it's like, well, wait a minute, hold on. The Kenyans are just across the border. But what he said was that the problem in Uganda is that
Some parts of Uganda. Some parts of Uganda. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Some parts of Uganda. I mean, we're talking about a rural area and
Yes.
rural people. He said, people can get their pay and then they don't come back to work for another 2 days because they're happy enough. They don't, whatever they've had some money, and they don't feel they need to suffer by coming to work. They're happy to just be at home and do whatever. Whereas in Kenya, if people don't work and don't work hard and don't have a job, they starve. So in other words, the good climate here, the way we can produce more food and so on, actually means that people don't have to suffer. There's less land in Kenya. People have to suffer more, which then engenders discipline. It was to do with the quote that you talked about. That then engenders discipline, and they then, you find somebody comparing the two. I'm not making this judgment. This is a Kenyan who has worked in both societies. But the Kenyans actually work harder because they have to. Because Ugandans, life is better in a way. You see what I mean? So I don't know. I mean, it's all coming back to this thing about choices and character and discipline. A mother, last night I was out for dinner, and a mother said, I think she had a relative staying with them, and he had a job. And she was saying, but I have to get him out of bed because the guy would just wander into work at 10 o'clock in the morning, and he's got the privilege of having a job as an internship, I think, perhaps. But, he's not bothered. Now, you see what I mean? There's a whole, you call it self-inflicted suffering, but I call it discipline.
Sorry.
And I think, there is this relationship between I can choose an easy life or I can choose some discipline, but those who will choose the discipline will certainly go further in dealing with the difficulties that life will throw at them. Yeah.
So I think that the distinction we are making
Yeah.
is between a disciplined life
Yeah.
and an indisciplined life.
Yeah.
Both have consequences. You have a disciplined life because there are certain values you cherish. The indiscipline also has certain values, but those values actually don't add up to flourishing, fruitfulness. And so, and I like this because this is the positive side. Let's speak more about discipline rather than suffering. Let's talk about choices and values rather than suffering. Let's talk about indiscipline, laziness,
Which can become selfishness.
Absolutely, and greed. And greed. I mean, look at our economy. This economy can go nowhere. I see people in bars in Kampala, kids spending money they have not earned. I mean, do we have hope when that happens? So they are having pleasure, but that's indiscipline. That's recklessness. They may say we are not suffering. They're driving nice cars, for which you are like, there's even an economy that supports indiscipline. I am told that one of the biggest products in banks today are salary loans. Salary loans, David, for your generation. And they're taking salary loans to drive a nice car. They're taking a salary loan to buy and I'm like, no, it takes time to grow. It takes discipline. So when finally we have an economy that doesn't function, please, what has happened to us? It's indiscipline. What has happened to our roads? You and I suffer on our roads. And we're really suffering on our roads. Most of the suffering on our roads is indiscipline, lack of the rule of law. So let's therefore, some of us must make the choice. If Uganda has made the choice to fight indiscipline, to fight misrule, to fight abuse of power, let me tell you, Uganda would be a better country. There would be less suffering for the masses.
Yes,
and fewer diseases. If you went to a hospital, you'd get drugs, but look at what's happened to us.
So, David, you talked about empathy earlier on. I don't know if you want to move on and talk about that. Because when Elon Musk...
Before you... there's a quote that I wanted to read for you in regards to empathy, then we can do the discussion. So it says, evolution has yet to transcend that simple barrier. We care deeply, selfishly, about those we know, but that empathy rarely extends beyond our line of sight.
Yeah.
And in terms of those that we know, it is a spectrum. There are those people who only know themselves,
Yeah.
and they only care.
Okay.
And then there are those people who only know their family. Then there are those people who only know their tribe. There are those people who only know their country or continent. And then there are those people who only know humanity at this time. And that brings in the question of empathy. Maybe it is a glitch in the way our brains work or the way our society is set up. But as you have discussed, it is very key for us to do away with the indiscipline and the greed and the injustice, and bringing up the empathy that is needed. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to say about Elon Musk, it was an interesting, where the richest man in the world took away the aid from the poorest people in the world. And actually he said something about empathy, that empathy was a problem for societies, we had too much empathy. And I presume I don't know what he meant, but he said that empathy was an issue. Well, he's not suffering from that. He doesn't have any empathy. But there's also this, perhaps what he might have been references is if you're going to do something that's for the good of a whole society, then some individuals are probably going to suffer because of that. And so because you're empathetic with some of these individuals, you don't make a decision that would be for the betterment of the whole society. For example, and this is maybe getting complicated, but for example, during the COVID crisis, the numbers of people in Britain claiming welfare, I think, doubled. So their budget pretty much doubled there. And there are certain benefits that are there in Britain, but it's bankrupting the society. They've no money to do anything because they're paying out all these benefits. Now on top of that, they have the boat people coming, the immigrants, and it's actually beginning to just, people are becoming, I needn't say racist, but they're certainly anti-immigrant because this money's all going out on welfare. So, but to make the decision that you would cut back on that welfare would obviously hurt some poor people, and so they're stuck there. So if they do the thing that would maybe be for the good of all, that would help maybe society at large and maybe prevent a lot of this creeping anti-immigrant feeling. They'd have to cut benefits. They'd have to, and then you'd have individuals who would be hurt from that, and you can't be empathetic. So it's one of those things where I can see how a society gets into a bind, and then the long-term result is bad. So.
I really want to, the quote you make, and the connecting with what Ian is saying, and even the very first question you asked us, childhood memories. Let me begin there and connect it to empathy. So, Bufumbira, my primary school, on the horizon, beyond our area, were hills. For me, they were mountains. But they were hills. But as a little child, they were mountains. And there was nothing beyond the mountains. On either side, our whole area, mountains either. And I can tell you, as a little child, the only way I imagined being human was Bafumbira. When I first saw people who didn't look like Bafumbira, they were not humans. They were something other than. So when I started talking about Bazungu, the language of Bazungu was a language that did not characterize them as, it was to characterize them as other than human. Other than, and the definition of human was so dependent upon that horizon. Right? I went to Ntare School. And in Ntare School, my first time to go beyond these mountains. I was fascinated that there was a bigger world out there. Then I meet people from northern Uganda and eastern Uganda in Ntare school. And I encountered people in Ankole who, because I spoke Rufumbira, they called it Runyarwanda. And they said, you are Banyarwanda, you don't belong, all right? And then they also characterized people from northern and eastern as Bakoko, you know. In other words, I encounter a people who defined to be human by, again, limited to their own kith and kin and people who looked like them. But I can say to you, one of the gifts of Ntare School was to broaden my horizons about people. The teachers were white people. But actually, by the time I finished Ntare, I had, in my mind, become to discover that these are not white people. They are human beings that have a pigmentation of the skin that's different from mine. I developed friends. So I think that the point I really want to make, that to the extent that our empathy is limited to those we call our kith and kin, it's a manifestation of our immaturity. To grow to be better human beings, to mature, to grow, means that you actually begin to discover that beyond these labels, we are all simply human. Now, these caricatures are created. They do not just happen by accident. There are people who benefit from the dehumanizing of other peoples. It's about power. So a conversation has to be had about power, particularly public power. So it serves whiteness, and I make a distinction between whiteness and blackness. Blackness is a definition of being human that is just limited to being black. Whiteness is a definition of being human. It's simply a statement about being in the world. Or tribalism, the isms you talk about, you know, we are better than them. No. How do we therefore celebrate to be human? And it is impossible to celebrate being human without empathy. And empathy is essential only with the other. It is not empathy if it is with your kith and kin. Let me put it differently. I have a responsibility when my wife is sick. When my wife is sick and we go to hospital, that's not empathy. When my child is sick, I must do something about it. That's not empathy.
That's responsibility.
That's responsibility.
Responsibility.
You have responsibility to your family. You have responsibility to your kith and kin. You have responsibility because they are your proximity. But when do we discover that we are responsible beyond our kith and kin? That's what empathy does. So empathy is primarily, in my view, about recognizing the human in the other.
Yeah, I think entirely. You know, when you, I mean, we've all had the experience where you're at the traffic lights and you have these folks who are coming begging and stuff. And it's hard because, you know, you're in your car and you've eaten a good meal and, you know, you have these kids running around. And you feel guilty, you know, just the fact that these are human beings who are not as privileged as you are. And I think empathy will drive people to, that's where people say, I want to make a better world.
Yeah.
You know, because it's the sense of this is humanity. And I like the point that you make that your own family, it's not really empathy, that's responsibility. I always taught the nurses, you know, because you get patients coming to hospital. Now, by definition, when somebody comes to hospital, they are emotionally traumatized. You know, they might be suffering pain, but they're emotionally vulnerable at that time. And they really need nurses, especially nurses, and those attending them to be empathetic to them, you know, to be being empathetic can work itself out in very many ways. And I saw nurses who were horribly unempathetic. You know, they were just too harsh with the patients. But then when their own mother would come in, you know, their family came in, they were a completely different attitude. And so I ended up saying to nurses, this is some years ago now, I think the nursing care is much, much better now that I've seen. Well, it's different,
you wish.
different places. Different in different
You
places.
just wish.
But,
Because selfishness hasn't disappeared, unfortunately.
So I said to people, look, every patient who comes in, think of them as your family, as your mother.
Yes.
That's how you have to treat those people. And I loved the nurses, really going back many, many years. There was a nurse we had called Grace, came away from your side of the country, and she was a Machiga. And she was in the midst of Luero then, we were, post-war Luero and all that. And she was just wonderful with the patient, she'd just be like a mama, what's wrong with you, And these old ladies, I reference, especially the old women who come in, they're smelly, they're dirty, they're, all of that. And you'd get some other nurses, I'll not say from which hospital, who would say, they'd be just harsh with these people, it'd be lording it over them, so that's
I think you make a really good point, Ian. Acting out of guilt is not empathy. When you roll your window
and give them
and give them
2,000,
2,000, that's not empathy. That's guilt. What Ian says, empathy means what should I do for the dignity of all these on the street? That is empathy. So empathy is precisely the point you make. These are our children. Theodore and I started work in the slums of Kalere many, many years ago. And I'll tell you what drove us. We were walking in the slums of Mulago and Kalere. And we saw a little boy, this one day, we saw a little boy drinking from the gutters, And oh dear, that little boy was about the same age as Joshua, our son. And we had known the story, that the gutters of the slums are completely foul. Fecal matter is what you know what I'm talking about. Why? Because there are no latrines, there are no toilets. You know how it is, they throw, their stuff, the kids' stuff. So you are literally drinking defecated water. And we went back home, we were distressed. But the thing that hit us was that it was not for the sake of this little boy we were going to do it. It was actually for Joshua's sake. The sense we had, this boy is simply our Joshua. Just that Joshua had different circumstances, but Joshua could be literally in that. So we decided we will do something for the many Joshuas in the slum. And of course, that led us to one thing to the other. So this acknowledging of the human, not out of guilt, but not out of guilt and more privilege. No, our privilege is responsibility. When shall we begin to see privilege as responsibility? And I think that is really, really powerful, that distinction you help us to make. Yeah.
Oh, great conversation. I think we now have to wrap it up. I want us to close on 2 points. One is that of the suffering which doesn't touch us, like you've mentioned the suffering of other people, and but I want us to get more in depth, maybe from Ian's side, in terms of how to deal with it. Yeah, the injustice that you've said, because we've seen that there are neighborhoods or there are people around us going through this suffering, but it doesn't touch us. Like, let's say there are certain policies that are in the country, and they really cause suffering to people who are not us. Maybe the corruption that doesn't make healthcare available, or education. Yeah. And what is the best way to go about that, especially for young people? Yeah. And then the other one is for individuals in our lives that are experiencing suffering, say terminal illness or chronic illness or loss of loved ones, or suffering maybe with indiscipline there, or addicted. I've had conversations with people who have people in their families who are addicts and they're suffering these things. Yeah, those 2 points. Yeah.
I think for me, it's about what can I do that is practical for me and is going to be meaningful? For example, if you, as a doctor, if I come across an accident and I don't have any, I've no tools of the trade with me, what I'm able to do for that person is going to be pretty limited, actually, even as a doctor. But if I am able to, get an ambulance and get that person into an accident emergency, then I can do an awful lot more. And so you said about guilt and, so sometimes we see things going on around us, but it's very difficult for us to change that situation much. But we feel bad about it. We feel guilty about it. And I feel like life is a balance. For me, it's a balance. It's not, I'm not Mother Teresa. I'm not going to choose suffering. I don't think suffering purifies or does anything like that. I don't think it's got any great characteristics, but I do have to have a certain amount of discipline. But I also want to have a meaningful and happy life. So I make certain choices. So, even in my business life, where I make some choices to do certain businesses, I can see it in terms of it will have a meaningful effect on some people's lives. And I can do that. People, you can see that, and of course you can see that easily in doing healthcare. Yes, and that's healthcare's been my life, and I'm glad that I chose to be a doctor. Glad you chose to be a doctor too, David. It's something that you can really do that's meaningful to people. And then people said, well, why did you go into farming? But for me, farming is just a continuation of trying to work in a rural area. I started in a rural area as I said, I grew up in a rural area, and I went to a rural area in Luero, and I'm so back to a rural area in Jojo, and through the work that I'm doing there, I can have a business that can be sustainable, can make profit, and can also impact the community, and can also help to alleviate poverty. I really believe in that, and I'm trying to do more stuff that will have impact. So that's something I can do, but there may be other things. All right, let me give you a concrete example. I went into politics because I was frustrated by the state of the drainage channels and the roads and everything in this side in McKinney. I thought I could do a better job than the incumbent. And but when I got into politics, my job was about emptying latrines which were overflowing. It was a public health job, really. And, I was able to do something, although toward the end of it, I was like, it was frustrating because there wasn't enough funds. And in this, especially in this election that's coming up, I've had so many people saying, please come back, we'll support you. You did a good job, we want you to come back. And I say, no, because I can't address the situation in the slums meaningfully. I can't, and people, because politics is so degraded, no matter what my good intentions will be, everybody will be coming to me, to get transport for funerals, to get money for this, for me to be, and it just degraded, it becomes meaningless. So I might be going there with, all good intentions to help slum dwellers, but if there's no means to do it in terms of any budget, and also because the view of politicians is now completely degraded, there's just no point in going there. So I think what we can do to alleviate suffering for others is different for different individuals. But it must be what's within what you can do. You can't save the world. You can't save even Uganda. And you have your life to run, and you have your happiness. There's no point in. I have a great admiration for people who really, sacrifice for, a cause.
Yeah, but Ian.
But I'm not sure. There's a
balance.
balance.
Wait a moment, Ian. You yourself gave up something in order to do something. The reason I don't like that word sacrifice, because it sounds ascetic and so on.
Yeah.
We all give up something for something is of value.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
but where I was going to go actually, which in totally with you, as I hear your story, Ian, you're simply saying, I realized that to be able to make a difference, I entered into business. I entered politics to make a difference. Because actually, most of the suffering that is inflicted upon our people, the one you speak about, the one which you say we may not feel, is systemic and structural. And to be able to change systems and structures, it's two things. It's economy. People must be employed. It's work. People must have wealth in their families. What creates wealth is not praying and singing and churches. I mean, if you give me another moment, I would, please give us a time to talk about the danger of religion. It's horrible, horrible. It's not more churches that will change Uganda, you know? It's not. It's more businesses. It's more ethical businesses. What's happened in our country is business has been vulgarized. The second vulgarization is politics. You know, business is greed, it's stealing. Politics is also stealing. And the problem we have is, of course, dysfunctional political and business systems. Now, I would say that the other way to reflect on the question you've asked is how do we grow empathy? Because in saying that there is a suffering that doesn't touch me, the only way in which we seek to make a difference is when that suffering actually touches you. How do we grow empathy? I learned for myself that one way to stay empathetic is to stay connected with the people who are on the margins. So I stay connected with younger people who have no jobs. I stay connected with the slums of Kampala. I meet with them, I speak with them, so that it's not their problem, it's my problem. It's us together. The real critical challenge, back to the conversation on empathy, how do we grow empathy? Because, David, for as long as the suffering is theirs, you have an us-them barrier, we will do nothing about it. We can only do anything meaningful if that suffering ceases to be theirs, it's yours as well, because you recognize in them a common humanity that you share. In that sense, we need to begin to embrace the suffering of others. And that's why, personally, I think it's important for us who are privileged to be intentional about staying connected with the margins. Yeah. Being connected meaningfully, not for the savior. No, I think the savior mentality is disastrous. And I can tell you this is why I always thought that the missionary agenda was horrible, because it came with it a savior mentality. You know, the whites will come and save Africans. And I'm not surprised you quit it, Ian, because I don't think you could make a good missionary, because you're not a good savior. You know? That's wonderful. And Lord, please send them back, these missionaries who are saviors. I think the savior mentality, you know, politicians want to save the world, they are horrible. Let's vote them out. You know, I saved you, I liberated. No. It's only to the extent that you realize you are inextricably connected with one another as human beings.
Being grounded, you know, what you're talking about is being grounded. And I think once you, either as a politician or a missionary or a religious person, just get into your own bubble, then, you know, you'll find it's you know, you just, yeah. So I mean, one of the things I've really enjoyed about Uganda is just how integrated it is. You know, like you meet intellectuals like Zach, you meet very rich people, and then you have the slum dwellers, and we're all together. We're all cheek by jowl. And if you're prepared to be grounded, as you say, you'll. One of the things that actually always keeps me grounded is the hash. This Monday night run when the whole collection of people from different walks of life come together and walk and run. And often we go through slums, sometimes just through terrible, terrible slums. And you're sort of going through where people have hung out there washing and duking through little paths and mud and jumping over, ditches and the smell of sewage and stuff like that. And, you really see Kampala for what it is. And that, is I think, to be grounded and then to be able to relate to, which none of us have a problem with, the high people and the low people. As you say, they're human beings.
We are human
and
beings.
And it doesn't really matter.
At the end of the day. Yeah.
Wow, great conversation. Being grounded. I like the way we've concluded that. It has just taken me back to my experience visiting the Genocide Memorial in Kigali and the World War I Memorial, the World War II Memorial in the US. I think there is a role of preserving those things that keeps those people grounded to whatever, to the atrocities. And when I was there, I thought about how there is nothing in Uganda to take you back to what happened in the wars that have gone through this country.
Don't take me on memorials. Don't start us on a new conversation, because those memorials are intended to create a certain narrative.
Yeah, definitely.
So
they have, but there's they also play a role in grounding people. But I also relate with Ian. There's a friend of mine who is a photographer, and he walks through slums taking photographs every other time. I joined him one time, and I think it's really grounding to go to those places your work doesn't take you normally, and you're just
let
going
me be
to
very
see
clear,
them.
my brother David. I am not really discussing going to the slums to take pictures. No.
That's not what.
No, let's just characterize this. It's not running through. I'm simply saying that you've got to have a life. Ian knows. You've got to have real people. You're paying school fees for them. Their lives affect your life. Theodora went in, they gave her a mat. I think there has got to be a way in which their lives touch your life touches them. No, you're not a visitor. And that takes discipline, back to discipline. Yes. So I think let's make a distinction between what grounding really means. And maybe that's the conversation we should have. What does grounding look like? What does grounding look like? Because I think that's actually the problem. Most politicians, most pastors, bishops, and so we are completely not grounded. We are seeking to serve our own interests. So I think the grounding idea is massive.
Yeah. All right. So I think as we conclude our discussion today, we started out from suffering and went down to discipline. In discipline, we went through empathy. And one thing that I think we shall touch on is the systems thinking lens that we used here. We didn't use it explicitly, but it's there. Because when we look at certain things, they are the tip of the iceberg. But then there are all these other things down there. And I like that we've touched them, because from the surface, it's like there's this suffering, but then there are these other choices and forces that cause the suffering or alleviate it or change the way we look at it. And to our listeners, we hope that this has been a great conversation for you to ask more questions about how you can get more disciplined, about how you can raise disciplined children, about how you can give your life to alleviate suffering and bring about more justice, more happiness, and make the world a better place. Thank you. Till next time.